What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are here with Avengers versus X-Men versus Eternals, the Judgment Day event. And this story, here's the thing, this first issue pops off. I mean, it's just like, boom, it hits hard. What this initially does here is it picks up with a kind of discussion between Tony Stark and Sersi of the Eternals. Now, one of the things to know is that for a lot of new comic book readers, this is cool. If you are an older comic book reader, this is a throwback to like the 80s and 90s, right? This is a throwback to the days when like Sersi and the Eternals were far more involved with human affairs than we've seen recently, specifically Sersi. She's been very, very important when it came to just the overall history of the Avengers, the X-Men, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of stuff there, and so it's kind of cool to see because it takes me on a bit of a nostalgia trip from way back in the day. But the thing about this is that there's kind of a conversation that's going on between the two. Now, one of the things to know is that Sersi, while her and Tony Stark have, of course, been together physically a variety of times and so on, she never really took them all that seriously. And that's because despite all of his vaunted intelligence and all that kind of stuff, Tony Stark never really took himself all that seriously, right? He's a jokester. He's a playboy, right? He's the guy, he's got it where it counts, but he just kind of passes himself off and puts himself off as the guy that never takes anything seriously, so nobody ever really takes him seriously. That's one of the reasons why the Civil War story was so important, is because it was one of the very few stories that you've seen over the course of Marvel's publication history that focus on Iron Man outside of like Demon in a Bottle or Armor Wars or something like that, that showed a very serious side of Tony Stark, which was really, really cool. But the thing about this is that as they're having this conversation, there is a bit of a discussion about how effectively the Eternals are now aware of the fact that the X-Men have the power of resurrection. Now, this was actually brought to the Eternals by way of someone named the Jack of Knives. Jack of Knives is an Eternal. Basically, Jack is one of the Eternal crime lords, and that's one of the things that we'll talk about as we go through this video, is how the Eternals roster and the overall system is kind of expanded really under the writing of Kieron Gillen, of course, largely being done most likely as a result of the MCU. But that when that information was brought to the Eternals, the question is, well, what do we do with this now? And initially, the Eternals were like, who cares? It doesn't really matter. That was until the concept of excess deviation was brought in, which is that mutants are basically an offshoot of the deviants. That somewhere along the line, a deviant gene entered the human genome, likely through procreation, and that all mutants that exist now are basically a result of humans possessing a deviant gene. That's what the X gene is. Now, I have, ever since this was introduced, we did a video on Geek Culture Explained where it's like, that's the Marvel Cinematic Universe's end for mutants in the MCU. That's how they're going to introduce them. They're going to say the mutants are basically just an offshoot of the deviants. Done, right? That's why this is being done. There's no other reason to alter the entire history and the origin of mutants outside of that. There's really no reason to do that. So the fact that they're doing it here, that's what really changes things. That's why it matters, is because it's going to become an MCU thing. But in the midst of this conversation, suddenly you end up having basically Sersi, who's taken by like Echo and Thor and Captain Marvel, basically like attacked and whisked away. Now, the reason why this is done, why she's overpowered, is because Sersi, if you're going to take her out, you've got to be quick, because Sersi is a matter manipulator. She's not universe-wide. She can't alter reality on a universal scale, but she can alter the structure of people she's facing off against, knock them unconscious, any number of things. So if they attacked her and the battle went on for more than like a minute, Sersi would basically get the upper hand with a quickness. That's how powerful she is, right? Somebody who's able to overcome basically almost anybody up to a particular limit, most earthbound people. And so that basically allows the Avengers to take Sersi away. And so what this does is it switches over to the X-Men at the Treehouse in New York. Now remember, for those of you guys who are catching up with us, the Treehouse is basically the X-Men's field base in the city of New York. They do exist in Krakoa, but the Treehouse is kind of like a field base, right? It's where they can operate out of. Specifically, the main X-Men team, Cyclops, Jean Grey, different things like that. Now, what's kind of funny here, and this is something that has not been explicitly addressed yet at the time that this comic was launched, is that Cyclops is basically in his normal garb. He's not Captain Krakoa. So we're still fleshing out exactly how that works in relation to the greater landscape. Because remember, Cyclops' death was public. People aren't supposed to know he's still alive. But one of the things that gets talked about here is the fact that the story of Ben Urich that we had covered previously, which was him basically revealing to the world that the mutant population has the ability to resurrect themselves, that this has become known, and not everybody has reacted to it in a positive way. Some people have reacted to this in a predictable way, which is that, oh my God, the mutants have the ability to come back to life. Well, now they're more of a threat than they ever were. Whereas other people are reacting to it with anger, right? Like, a woman's daughter is still dead. How come the X-Men get to come back and her daughter doesn't? The reality here, though, is that Cyclops goes as far as to say that the Five can only really bring back certain people, specifically those whose minds have been backed up by Cerebro. That's one of the caveats that was established during Hickman's run, that if they brought back this this woman's dead daughter, she would just be a body with no memory of who she was before. Literally, she'd be just kind of teaching her everything new. So it'd be her daughter who had returned, but her daughter wouldn't know who she was. Again, it's one of those things where Cyclops isn't saying that the Five can't bring them back literally, it's the Five can't bring them back as they know them, which is what they want. They want, that woman wants her daughter to come back as she knew her daughter, that kind of a thing. And so what ends up going on here is you basically have a kind of meeting between Nightcrawler and Destiny and Mystique. Now remember, what's been going on since the return of Destiny is Marvel's largely been building on her ability to see the future. Now, the way that Marvel plays this, and it's one of the coolest things about it, Destiny has a wide and varying way in which her ability to predict the future works. The most popular version, and the one that there was an entire story arc based around, was called Destiny's Diaries. Basically, these instances where she had written down how things could play out in the future, and it was people's desire to find those diaries so they could ensure that things unfolded in the way they wanted to, or stop particular things from happening. And so what this does is it kind of segues into the modern era, which is if something's going to happen in 10 minutes, Destiny knows right off the bat. If something's going to happen in a day or in a week or a month, she can predict it pretty accurately. But if we're talking about something in 50 years, it may or may not come to fruition, because a lot of things can happen in the span of 50 years that can prevent that from happening. Specifically, what Destiny does here is she says the Eternals are coming, right? The Eternals are going to try to kill us all. This war is right around the corner. It's like right there, and I can see it coming. And so in response to that, Nightcrawler basically travels to Araco, right? Travels to Mars, and then essentially tells Storm and Magneto and all those guys, we have to assemble the Quiet Council. We've got to assemble the Great Circle, or the Great Ring in Araco, basically their governing body. We have to make sure people know the Eternals are coming for us all. The thing about this is that Destiny does not specifically know why the Eternals are going to do it. She simply just knows that they are, right? That she's predicted that they are going to go to war with the mutants, and if the mutants are not prepared, they're all going to die. Now, the funny thing about this is that it's kind of approached in different ways. Storm herself is like, okay, we have to approach this from more of a political standpoint. How do we deal with this on a political perspective? Magneto's whole stance is we'll confront this force when it comes head on. And he even goes so far as to say that the Eternals are the old gods, right? They were created by the Celestials, these beings that were supposed to keep the world safe and all that kind of stuff. We've moved beyond them. We don't need the protection of the Eternals. We have our own cure for death, right? We've solved the equation of resurrection. We are more powerful than they are, and we're larger in number than they are. They're simply launching this attack against us because, much like the humans, they're afraid of their own mortality. We represent the next stage of not really just evolution, but the next stage of moving beyond them, right? If they are our parents, we are the children ready to step out into the world. And he even goes as far as to say, we are the world's new gods now. And so that's kind of the funny thing, because at that point, you transition to Avengers Mountain, which is where, at least is a place deep inside the mountain, where essentially no telepathic abilities will work. So no one can read the mind of Iron Man and Sersi. I mean, she can read his mind, I guess, but she can't telepathically call for help. Literally, it's one of those things where it's like, no one can hear you scream. There's no one you can call for, so you better start answering my questions. And again, she just doesn't really take him seriously. She's literally mocking him. He's like, if you were in my shoes, what would you do? And that kind of a thing. And she's like, I would never be in your shoes because, they don't look good, right? They wouldn't look good on me. That's when the conversation gets serious, where he's like, I'm not joking here. I'm not dicking around. I'm not goofing off, right? I am serious here. I am 100% serious, right? I totally get that you are doing your thing, that you as Eternals, you have your own society, you're not really a family, you have your own campaigns and what have you, and you do your stuff. And that's fine, right? It's always been that way. You do your thing, we do our thing. You don't show up for every Avengers Crisis event, and we don't show up for every Eternals event. But it becomes an Avengers problem when we find out that Thanos exists on Earth, that he's here and he's running the Eternals. Right now, at the moment, Thanos has been defeated, but that entire story arc, right, where Thanos was on Earth and running the Eternals never told the Avengers. And the response of Iron Man is, this is a problem. Not only that, Earth was minutes away from destruction, and at no point did you tell us what was going on. That's when it becomes a problem, right? So these are kind of two different events happening at the same time. And so ultimately, the response of Sersi is, I regret that. And Iron Man's like, that's the problem, Sersi. You regret it, but you're not sorry about it. There's no apology here, right? You don't even say it was a mistake. Your regret was not the fact that you didn't tell us. Your regret was that we found out. That's the issue that you have, and that's why this is a problem. And so ultimately, because of how this interrogation is going, in the end, Captain America shows up here. Now, this is a great moment because what it does is it highlights how Captain America is viewed by everybody, right? He literally shows up and he's just like, this method of interrogation isn't working, Tony Stark. And here's the thing, Sersi was an Avenger at one point. We have to show her some level of trust. And he tells her, the Eternals are going to war with the X-Men. Tell us what you know. And Sersi, again, plays the same card she did with Iron Man, where she's like, well, I mean, I know that war is significantly more likely now that you've strapped me to this uncomfortable and unfashionable chair. And Captain America just looks at her. And that's when she realizes, okay, this is serious. That's the nature of Steve Rogers. And it's a very easy thing to overlook. It's one of those things, you look at Captain America and it's like, I mean, he's cool. He can run fast and punch hard. Wahoo, right? He'd make a great Olympian. You know, the USA champion in whatever competition he happens to be in. But the truth about this is because of the things that Captain America's done over his time as a superhero, and because of his standing among just anybody on Earth, human, mutant, eternal, otherwise, everybody respects him. And they know that when Captain America gets serious, when he stops joking, that's when things are a problem. And that's why Sersi stops. She drops the act and she's like, you're serious. A war, an actual war. And so she's like, what do you know? Right? Like, you have to know something. You wouldn't just kidnap me, bring me here, and then tell me a war is coming without having something to verify that's the case. And that's when Iron Man's like, okay, so since everything popped off with Thanos and we learned about all that stuff, we've basically been monitoring all Eternal activity. And what we found is that there was basically celestial energy that spiked and then ended, like almost immediately. And the response of Sersi is, but that's not weird. Like, cosmic energy, like literally your Fantastic Four have cosmic energy. That's not uncommon. And his response is, these are like a series of low-level rumblings that are happening around the world. Something's warming up. Something in the earth is coming. And because of the fact that you as Eternals have celestial energy, right? You're powered by cosmic energy and you've been here for like 1,000,000 years. Who else is it gonna be? Right? And so it's like, what are you doing? What do you have going on? And the response of Sersi is, here's the thing you need to understand. We as Eternals, we're a society. We're not a family, right? We don't owe anything to each other. We use the terms of familial relations, mother, father, brother, sister, but we use that as a stand-in for teammate, right? We use it in that capacity. We consider ourselves, I guess, a family to a degree because there is a finite number of us. There will never be any more Eternals. They're not being created anymore. We cannot die. We'll always come back, but we can leave at any point in time. And some of us have. Some of us have abandoned the Eternals and we've taken up residence with the Deviants. So here's the thing you need to understand. I'm not the Eternal that you have to worry about here. And so what you do is you switch over to Olympia, the capital of the Eternal City, and you have Druig, who is the Prime Eternal. He's the one running the show, addressing basically what will become the Unimind and essentially saying, here's the problem. We as Eternals were created for the purpose of, one, keeping the deviant population in check, and two, correcting excess deviation, which is a time where the deviant gene becomes corrupted, right? Like when deviants experience a mutation of their own, essentially. But unlike the human population that experiences a mutation and they develop a healing factor, or they become Charles Xavier who can read minds, when a traditional deviant undergoes excess deviation, they turn into some grotesque monster and actually start killing other deviants. We eliminate them. And he's like, but here's the problem. Somewhere along the line, the deviant gene entered the human gene pool, and now mutants are excess deviation. Our job to follow our charter, the task assigned to us by the Celestials, if we are going to correct, i.e. eliminate excess deviation, we have to kill the mutants. So I am asking the Unimind to vote on this. I'm asking the Unimind to support this, and the Unimind agrees. And so what this does is it leads to Druig visiting Uranos in the exclusion. Now, Uranos is one of the original Eternals. When the Eternals were initially created, right, which is to say, like, they were initially formed by the Celestials, Uranos was one of the first, and he is one of the most powerful of the Eternals. Now, initially, it was believed that he was dead, and in fact, he was kind of killed to a degree. Instead of him being resurrected, he was kind of sort of a patchwork clone. But the reality is, again, using the kind of familiar relations, he is by all standards of measurement the grandfather of Thanos, right? Like literally that's who he is. He's that powerful. He's on that level of scale. And it's one of these cool things where Druig says, okay, if we are going to launch an attack against the mutant population, you are arguably the most powerful of us. So we are going to give you a task. He says, you have an hour, 1 hour. The machine has coded you to return here instantly, right? Because remember, the whole idea behind Uranos is, and the reason why he's locked up, is that during the early days when the Eternals were initially created, Uranos thought that the best way for the Eternals to maintain their role was to literally eliminate all humans and all deviants, and then just conquer the world, and then spread out from there. That led to a civil war among the Eternals, and he was effectively killed, for lack of a better word, but then cloned and brought back. So he's not a truly resurrected Eternal. And so that's why he's a prisoner here, because the ongoing fear among the Eternals is that if he is released, he would incite another civil war among the Eternals, or perhaps just simply try to kill them all and then refuse to resurrect them, because he who is the Prime Eternal is the one that controls the machine, and he who controls the machine decides who gets resurrected. And so what Uranos says in one of the most amazing statements ever, he says, my own people have forgotten me. These mutants made Mars habitable in a day, but to destroy is always easier. A human takes 9 months to make another breathe. A human can crush a windpipe in seconds. You will see what Uranos the Undying can do with an hour. And so he basically goes forward on his mission, and we'll find out what that is. What this does is it switches over to Druig as part of the Damocles Foundation. Now, the Damocles Foundation was founded way back in the day. Its mission has basically changed now that Druig is the head. He's like the Prime Eternal. But initially, the basis behind the Damocles Foundation is that it was a coming together of humans and deviants and Eternals who believed that this kind of constant war that was going on between humans or between the Eternals and the deviants and whatnot would lead to the ruin of all. And so their goal was to actually find some kind of a peaceful resolution to this sort of warring nature of their differing societies, and then try to see that come to fruition. Sometimes this works, sometimes it hasn't. They've usually operated behind the scenes, but they've never really seen their goal come to fruition. But what ends up happening here is you actually have Druig, who's meeting with Moira McTaggart, and really she's allying with him with the idea of finding a way to eliminate the entirety of the mutant population. Because remember, Moira McTaggart was the one who started Krakoa in the first place, and unbeknownst to Xavier and Magneto, when they allied with her to create Krakoa, to create this mutant utopia, that what Moira McTaggart actually wanted to do was slowly eliminate the mutant gene so there would be no mutants. Because in every life that she lived, right, her power was to basically die and then to come back to life in essentially a new reality, right, kind of a restarting of the universe, so to speak, that in every single future that she saw, mutants were always killed. Mutants were always destroyed by the forces that they were going against, right? Humans, post-humans, whatever the case happened to be. So her idea was to essentially slowly phase out the X gene, remove it entirely, and save the lives of mutants by getting rid of mutants completely. And so when that was brought to fruition, she was stripped of her powers using the gun of Forge, right, which basically nullifies abilities, and she was kicked out of Krakoa. And so as a result of this, she kind of harbors this vendetta where, one, she has a kind of personal grudge to want to see Krakoa fail, but two, she's steadfast in her mission. And so as a result of this, what ends up happening is a kind of agreement that's struck where it's like, I will do what I can to work with you. Because right now, Moira McTaggart is allied with Orchis, right? For those of you guys who aren't following the X-Men comic, Orchis is just this organization that exists out there that is a combination of like Hydra and advanced idea mechanics and like former SHIELD agents and things like that, who are all working to bring down the X-Men. And so her allying with the Eternals basically provides the Eternals with the resources of Orchis, because for the moment, their goals are aligned. And so what you end up having is Druig revealing that what the Eternals are doing is launching a 3-pronged attack, which is genius in terms of how this unfolds. And that's what happens when you face off against the Eternals. They've been around for 1,000,000 years. They've watched wars, they've fought wars, they've observed them, they've seen how things go on, right? They see how to win in a conflict. The military strategy of Captain America is nothing in comparison to the strategy of the Eternals, because they've just been around for so long. And so what ends up happening is the first prong of this attack is the unimind of the Eternals, at least those who are still under the control, or at least under the leadership of Druig, the Prime Eternal. That unimind launches a telepathic attack against the Quiet Council and those telepaths who exist on Krakoa, right? Charles Xavier, Jean Grey, those guys, right? That kind of unified front. With that telepathic attack happening, right? Exodus and all those guys, with that telepathic attack happening, what it does is it keeps them distracted. It keeps them focused on that attack, on that conflict. While that conflict is happening, basically foot soldiers are sent in, right? And these foot soldiers offer another distraction for the other guys, Wolverine and Laura Kinney and Cyclops and Magic and all those guys, right? And because of the power of these forces, everybody literally runs to Krakoa, right? Like all the X-Men and everybody, they bail out on Arakko, they run to Krakoa, and they fight the battle there. Now, while that's going on, two other things go on. So I guess it's more of a four-pronged attack. Two other things happen. The next phase of the attack is for Druig to actually send in Jack of Knives. When Druig sends Jack of Knives in, because Jack of Knives is an Eternal that can render themselves invisible, that what it does is it allows Jack to get in there and start killing the Five, right? Remember, the Five are the ones who resurrect mutants. And so this is just ridiculously awesome. By targeting the Five, it destroys the ability for mutants to be resurrected, or at least that seems to be the case. Now, in order for that to happen, in order for resurrection to be in it entirely, all of the mutants have to, like all members of the Five, have to be killed. The problem is that Wolverine catches up to Jack of Knives. Now, under normal circumstances, Jack of Knives would be undetectable to Wolverine. Jack of Knives can mask their scent to the point that Wolverine can't pick it up. But what Wolverine does pick up is the blood on the dagger that Jack of Knives was using, which is a genius strat. It's just a genius piece of writing here. And so basically, it allows Wolverine to essentially stop Jack of Knives from killing all the members of the Five. And so this is when you get to the final phase of the attack, as it's outlined by Druig, right? The Jack of Knives did technically fail, and where Moira McTaggart is like, you had your one chance to destroy the ability for mutants to resurrect themselves, the response of Druig is patience, right? You are looking at things in the short term because you haven't lived as long as I have. It's all about patience, right? At the very least, we will have eroded their numbers. And when the question's asked by Moira McTaggart, well, what about all the mutants, the 1 million mutants that exist on Arakko, right? What about all of them? The response of Druig is, they're not our concern, because what you end up finding out is that the task of Uranos was to go to Arakko, to go to Mars, and kill every single mutant there. And he's seemingly done exactly that. Cable, Magneto, all those guys, Storm, he eradicated them all. That's the power of Uranos. That's how powerful that guy is. He killed them all, seemingly on his own. And so he's immediately teleported back as soon as that hour is over. Druig teleports back to the capital city, right, to the exclusion zone in the capital city of the Eternals. And that's when he's told by Uranos, you're gonna need me again, right? You have to let me out. You're gonna need me. And the response to Druig is, if that time comes, then we will let you out. But until then, that's not going to happen. And so in the face of all of this, right, with this attack launched on the X-Men, the entirety of the mutant population on Krakoa just in disorganized disarray, right? The mutants on Arakko, those individuals who can be resurrected, have been resurrected, right? Basically, the mutants just kind of left in a state of panic and chaos, having no real idea on what's going on. The response of Druig is to actually tap into the world's electronic systems and broadcast live simultaneously to every human around the world. And what he says is this. He says, people of Earth, I am Druig of the Eternals. I am speaking to you via your extremely impressive high-tech devices. And that's when, like, Captain America realizes everybody's getting this message. Even the Avengers are watching this message. And Druig says, I could use telepathy, but we consider that intrusive and crass. It's a nouveau immortal move. And yes, I'm talking about these mutants. They're a threat to you all. They have overstepped their natural bounds and clearly aim for a dominion that stretches across worlds and eternity. We apologize that we've let them go so far, but rest assured, we serve you, as we have for 1,000,000 years. And humanity is championing this. Humanity is celebrating this, right? Basically the Eternals stepping up and saying, we will eliminate the mutant threat for you. But Druig says, however, we must ask you to not be afraid of the towering death machines that have emerged off the western seaboard of the United States. They are not towering death machines, they are the Hex, and they are Eternals. Yes, we're not all human-sized, but rest assured, whether large or small, we are your protectors. That said, we would advise anyone in any coastal regions to head inland as swiftly as they can. It's possible this may get messy. Now, this is one of the things that's been going on with the Eternals comics. Those guys who haven't really been watching our videos on it, the entire basis behind Kieron Gillen's run with the Eternals is to expand them drastically. It's an entire society, and it's way more more than the Eternals that we were initially introduced to in Marvel Comics. There's so much more to them than that. They come in all shapes and sizes, all forms. It's wild how this is going down. It's really, really cool. And so in response to all of this, Captain America assembles the Avengers. And so what happens is that while the Avengers are being assembled and trying to find some way to respond to what the Eternals are doing, Iron Man picks up on basically an intrusion alarm. And when he gets there, he basically finds Ajax and he finds Makari. Now, the funny thing about this is that they're basically getting in the same way that like they had gotten in before, which Iron Man kind of takes as a little bit of an insult, but they've also got Sinister in tow, which explains why Sinister had basically vanished from the X-Men's Quiet Council, where it is that he's been all this time. He's being held captive by the Eternals. And the idea here, the goal of the Eternals, at least those who have broken away from Druig, who don't really operate under the Eternal main society, right? So think of them as like the American separatists that broke away from England and like founded what became the United States. That's kind of what the Eternals are to a degree. But the thing about this is their job is to say, okay, look, this is a holy war, right? Like what Druig is doing is he's building his actions based on the godly decree, right? The holy decree of the Celestials, which is we as Eternals correct excess deviation. He's using that as a reason to wipe out the X-Men. So if it is gods who established this, then it is gods who can correct this. We need the Celestials to make this happen. And we need a god as a Celestial that can do this for us, right? That can establish a new law. And when the question is asked by Iron Man, okay, I mean, this is interesting, but where the hell are you going to make a god in a few hours? The response of Makari and Ajax is, look around you, man. We're literally inside of a dead Celestial. It can't be that impossible to resurrect him. And the reality is that it's not. Remember, back in 2008, during Charles Knopf's run, which is at least one of the Eternals runs that we have. So we'll create a playlist for Judgment Day so it all kind of comes together and makes sense, that the Eternals do have an afterlife. They visit the Fulcrum once they basically quote unquote die, right? The Fulcrum being an aspect of the one above all. They do have like a kind of afterlife. You can recall a dead Celestial. You can bring them back. Now, whether or not that happens is something that we'll see over the course of this story. But I gotta say, man, Judgment Day hits with a bang. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.